Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping right into a really fascinating story out of rural Oregon. It's about a tangled web of power, money, and influence, and it really shows you how connected a small community can be for better and sometimes for worse.
So who really holds power in a small town? You might think the answer is simple, right? The mayor, maybe a wealthy business owner. But as we're about to see in Union County, Oregon, the reality can be way more complex. We're going to use this as our case study to see how leadership, healthcare, and public money can get so woven together that it's hard to tell where one ends and the next one begins.
All right, so here's the plan. We're going to start with the hospital that sits right at the center of it all. Then we'll look at the group in charge of protecting vulnerable kids. We'll trace the flow of public money, and then, this is the key part, we'll see how the leadership of all these groups connects. And finally, we'll get into the big debate: efficiency versus accountability.
Okay, let's start at the heart of this whole thing, Grande Ronde Hospital. And just so you know, it's pronounced Grande Ronde. For more than a century, this place has been so much more than just a hospital. It's really the economic and social backbone of the whole area.
You know, its history is pretty amazing. It kicked off way back in 1907 as this tiny little 6-bed clinic. Believe it or not, by the 1960s, it was about to go under completely. But the community rallied together, saved it, and helped turn it into the powerhouse it is today.
And powerhouse is absolutely the right word. To give you some scale, think about this number: over 800 employees. In a county with only about 26,000 people, that makes Grande Ronde Hospital, by far, the biggest private employer around. It's not just fixing broken bones. It's the lifeblood of the town's economy.
So our second key player here is the Mount Emily Safe Center, or MESC. Now this isn't just another nonprofit. It is the only child advocacy center for a massive 8-county region. That puts an incredible amount of responsibility on its shoulders to protect the most vulnerable kids in the area.
So what they do is just critical. Imagine a child who's been abused. Instead of getting dragged from a police station to a doctor's office to a therapist and having to relive that trauma over and over, MSC brings everything under one roof. They handle it all, from the first interview to long-term counseling, all designed to support the child without causing more pain.
So how does an organization this important keep the lights on? Well, look at this. About 75% of its money comes from grants. And that's a really important detail, because it means the center's very survival depends on keeping a good relationship with the people and institutions handing out that grant money. That creates a real dependency.
And that reliance on funding leads us directly to our third pillar, the group that basically controls the public healthcare money in this part of Oregon. It's called ECCO. That's EOCCO.
So EOCO is what's called a Coordinated Care Organization. The state set it up to manage Medicaid for tens of thousands of people across eastern Oregon. But, and this is the really interesting part, EOCO is co-owned by the exact same hospitals and clinics that it pays with that public money.
One source in the investigation had a perfect phrase for this. They called it a circular flow of power and money. Basically, you've got the healthcare providers who get the public funds, who are also on the board deciding how to hand out those funds. The money just goes in a circle.
So now we've got our three pieces, right? The hospital, the Child Advocacy Center, and the organization that manages the Medicaid money. On paper, they look like separate entities, but this is where you start to see the web. Let's actually connect the dots and see how these powerful organizations are locked together at the very top.
Okay, take a close look at this chart. You see the same names popping up in leadership roles across all these different groups. For example, look at Jeremy Davis. He's the CEO of the hospital, and he's also on the board of EOCO, the group that controls the hospital's public funding. And get this, Jared Rogers, who is the vice chair of the hospital board, is also the board chair for the Mount Emily Safe Center. These aren't just casual connections, they're direct overlaps in leadership.
Just let that sink in for a second. The number 2 person at the county's biggest employer, the hospital, is also the head of the one and only organization in charge of handling child abuse cases for the entire region. An organization that has financial ties to the hospital he helps lead.
And here's that other crucial link. The hospital CEO, Jeremy Davis, is helping to run ECOC, the very same organization that funnels millions of public Medicaid dollars right back to his own hospital.
Now, the investigation suggests this wasn't an accident. It's actually described in some documents as a sophisticated governance strategy. The thinking goes, in a rural place with a small talent pool, this is a smart way to keep control local and make sure vital services can survive.
And that brings us to the core tension of this whole thing. Is this a genius model for rural efficiency, or is it a system with a huge, dangerous blind spot when you talk about accountability?
It's really a double-edged sword. On the one hand, yeah, having the same leaders at every table probably means you can make decisions fast. You get collaboration, you get local control, all good things for a remote area. But the flip side is a massive potential for conflicts of interest, for groupthink, and for decisions being made with almost zero outside oversight. The system's biggest strengths are also its biggest weaknesses.
So it all comes down to this really critical question. What happens when something goes wrong? When a system is this tightly woven, who can you possibly turn to for an unbiased, independent review?
The source material points to one deeply disturbing case that seems to highlight these exact risks. According to the reporting, it involves a man who allegedly had a botched surgery at the hospital. The source alleges he was then separated from his wife and put into foster care, and was ultimately murdered, with the alleged motive being to get away from any oversight.
And this case really puts a fine point on the central question of the investigation. In a system where the hospital, the legal system, and social services are all tangled up, with overlapping leadership, how can you possibly have real independent accountability?
So the investigation leaves us with some really tough questions. You have to ask, do these interlocking boards end up protecting their own organizations instead of seeking an outside review? Does a board that appoints its own successors, like the one at Grande Ronde Hospital, end up shutting out new ideas? And does having the same people in power for decades, while maybe good for stability, also create a resistance to change?
In the end, the source material's argument is this. Trust and close relationships are absolutely the foundation of life in a small town, but they aren't enough on their own. For a community to truly thrive, it needs systems that are not just trusted, but transparent and, most importantly, accountable.
And that brings us right back to where we started, with this fundamental challenge. For any community, big or small, how do you strike that incredibly difficult balance between the efficiency you get from a tight-knit system and the transparent oversight you need to protect everyone inside it? It's a huge question, and there are no easy answers.